They also did a study last year on lawyers. And this covered, it was another big survey, and they surveyed over 12,000 lawyers from around the country. And what they found was depression rates of 28%. That's 4 times the national average. Okay. Suicidal ideation, 11.5%. That's 5 times the national average. Okay? If you try to get a sense of the proportion of that, there's 1.2 million lawyers practicing in America today. So if you plug that depression rate in, that means that 365,000 lawyers across America, or roughly the size of the population of Pittsburgh, are suffering from depression right now. The same study found also problems with anxiety and stress, okay, about double the national average. And I think this is significant because, for lots of reasons, but one of the reasons it's significant is that most people with a mood disorder, such as depression, also have an anxiety disorder. It's called comorbidity. And they believe it's because the part of our brain that regulates our moods, the limbic system, is involved, deeply involved with anxiety and depression and actually stress management. So many people with depression and anxiety are not good at stress management. When I was talking about that with a fellow lawyer, I said I wasn't very good, and it had a role in my developing depression. How ironic is that? I'm a trial lawyer and I'm very busy and very stressed. But that's the problem. You know, people who are successful aren't necessarily good at managing stress. I mean, the best example is that at law schools. You're all very accomplished, otherwise you wouldn't be in law school. But many of you are not good at managing stress, just like I wasn't, right? Let's talk a little bit about some causes. For me, I like to think of it as the perfect storm. In my family tree, there's a lot of people with depression or bipolar or addiction problems. I never thought I would be one of those people because I didn't like to drink, smoke, take drugs. I was a good kid who got good grades. But looking back on it, they believe that as much as 50% of people who develop depression have a genetic component to it. The other thing that's important to recognize, and there's a lot of research being done on trauma these days. I had a traumatic childhood. My father was a severe alcoholic, and he died from alcoholism when he was 56. And I imagine that if we look back on it and he was evaluated, they would have determined that he had either depression or bipolar disorder. You know, at that time, they didn't have many resources to diagnose someone or treat them. So I brought that risk factor with me into law school, right? Genes, trauma, personality. Most lawyers, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, they've studied this, and not surprisingly, many people who go into law school and become lawyers are type A personality types, right? They're self-starters, they're driven, they're perfectionist, they can be kind of pessimistic, okay? So there's a certain personality type that generally goes into law. Many exceptions. But the studies have shown that there's that link. And finally, and I think that's true for me, personality-wise, but finally the stress of being a lawyer. And when I talk about stress, I often say, you know, stress is a very good thing. For much of my life, and I think even now, people are motivated by stress, so there's good stress, right? What I'm talking about is chronic, unremitting, perpetual stress, which humans didn't evolve to handle that kind of stress in their bodies and their brains. So much of the law practice today and the experience of many lawyers is that there's just too much stress involved in the day-to-day life of being a lawyer. So for me personally, and each person may have a different story, it was the perfect storm of these things that I think coalesced and created depression for me. I mentioned personality. This is just a recap of what I was talking about. Highly ambitious. How many of you, raise your hands, can identify with some of those qualities? Oh, more than a couple. Okay. And I think one of the things that's interesting, pessimism. When we talk about pessimism, and this has been researched and written about as it relates to lawyer personalities, what it means is not so much is the glass half empty or half full. That's not what we're really talking about. It's called a cognitive explanatory style, all right? So it's a way of looking at the world in a negative way, all right, that puts you in the position of you're always looking for trouble, all right? You're always problem solving. You're always on your toes thinking something bad's going to happen, okay? And I, as a lawyer, and many, hundreds and hundreds of lawyers I've talked to around the country said that is dead on. And why is that dead on? Because I'd walk into a courtroom or in a deposition and I'd be scanning my environment looking for trouble, looking for an opposing counsel that was going to be a jerk that day. I'm thinking, oh, I'm in for a long day, right? I better get my back up. Or it might be something as I'm sitting at my desk and I see a fat package come in from an opponent, and it's a motion, on a case. So you develop that capacity, and I think it's often something, they say it's, you learn to think like a lawyer. They say that in law school all the time, or they did when I was a law student. We're going to teach you to think like a lawyer. Well, part of that thinking is this kind of thinking. And what they found is that lawyers who have this quality are very successful people. Okay? The problem is, while it may make you very successful, it doesn't go a long way as far as establishing good mental health, right? People who are pessimistic don't necessarily have depression, but most people who have depression are pessimistic or negative thinkers. So that's another risk factor, right? When we think about depression and what causes it and why lawyers have so many problems with that. This is what I mean more specifically when I talk about stress and perpetual stress, okay? Fight or flight, the adversarial nature of the profession, winners, losers, time crunch, little time for self-care, okay? Some people, when I lecture on this, and I lecture to judges and trial lawyers, they will say, well, that's just the way it is. It is an adversarial profession. There are winners and losers. And, or they might say most of these problems are attributable to trial lawyers or people with big law firms. And the studies just don't bear that out. These depression rates hold constant across people who are in government and private practice, solo practice, big law firms. So there's something going on in the culture of the law. And that culture begins in law school, right? And then it continues on into the legal profession. The thing that I had the most difficulty with, I think, was number 1 and 2, and then the last one. I had always grown up in my family. It was a dysfunctional family. This is an understatement, but I was always kind of like the good kid, the overachiever, the family hero in my family of five kids. So I got along by always being a kind of a pleasant, conciliatory person. And this idea that all lawyers or trial lawyers or litigators are pit bulls is just false. Some of the nicest people I've ever met have been trial lawyers. But there is a group of people in that litigation group that are like that. And those are the people I would dread the most. When that happened, when I got those people, immediately my heart would start racing, I would sweat. I was terrified. You know, you couldn't show any of that, but I was. So I had the most difficulty with the adversarial nature of the profession, and consequentially, I also had little time for self-care, which was a big problem. Stigma. The studies that I showed you earlier about law school and the high rates of law students with depression, what was interesting was that not only were there high rates of law student depression and anxiety, is that most of them didn't seek out any treatment of any kind, whether it be with the counseling department at the law school or at the university or off-site. Okay? So they attributed, most of the people who responded to the study said the biggest reason was stigma, you know, being identified as somebody who had a mental problem, or they cited privacy concerns, or they talked about what's going to happen if my future employer finds out about this? Do I have to, what if it comes up on the character and fitness part of becoming a lawyer? So that's a big deal. And I think what we're finding is that law schools and across the country and law firms and the legal profession is saying this isn't working, you know, stigmatizing people, because what's happening is the depression rates and anxiety rates are not going down, they're going up. Historically, they're going up. So there's a high cost to be paid with stigma. I think for me, and it's different for every person, but in my family I experienced stigma because many people in my family, it was really pull yourself up by your own bootstraps kind of family upbringing. My dad was a World War II veteran, a kind of meat and potato, you know, have a beer every night kind of guy. And certainly talking about one's feelings or one's mental health problems weren't common at the dinner table. So people experience stigma at their job. They can experience within their family when they come home. And I think there's also this side of stigma that's an inside job, right? Many people with depression feel tremendous shame. You know, they feel like they're less than, or that they're losers. I've heard that a lot. Or that they're broken people, you know, they're not good enough, or those kind of things. I think that's true because depression is such a powerful experience for most people. And what's interesting is that when you go through a depression, many people with depression, everything shuts down, right? They appear flat and emotionless and lifeless. But they actually know that a lot is actually going on inside a person's brain when they're depressed.